Martha here. We're going to go over some of my notes from Great Gatsby Chapter 2. If I can find where I put that. Okay, I'm not going to start there then. Pretend like I'm not. Okay. Hey everybody, this is Miss Martha. We're going to go over some of my notes from Chapter 2 for The Great Gatsby. So this chapter starts out with a very detailed description of the Valley of the Ashes. And this is a place that is really important because it's a transition from one world to the next. From one world that Daisy and Tom and even Gatsby reside in to this completely different world. So let's read this description that's highlighted in blue here. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills, and grotesque gardens where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally with the transcendent effort of men who dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. So when we read that, we're supposed to get this feeling of just doom and gloom, basically just this cloudiness over everything. It's the area between the Eggs and New York. It's home to the working class, the lower class. It's in stark comparison to Tom and Daisy's house, especially when we looked at that scene of Daisy laying on the couch, and she was she was clothed in white clothing, but then the drapes were also flowing all around her in white, and we just had this scene of purity and innocence and wealth. And so the Valley of the Ashes is in direct comparison and contrast to that, because everything is clouded and soot, basically. Also, we see the first mention of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Let's read that passage that we see in blue. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and giant. Their retinas are 1 yard high. Obviously, if you read this on your own, which you should have, you'll realize that Dr. Eckelberg is a billboard, an advertisement for an eye doctor. But this eye doctor doesn't exist anymore. He's moved on, but the billboard remains. And the billboard is weathered, it's beaten, but it persists. And we see this next quote that says, standing behind him, Michaelis saw with a shock that he was looking at the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, which had just emerged pale and enormous from the dissolving night. God sees everything, repeated Wilson. So Eckelberg is obviously a symbolism for God. He's looking on. He is seeing all of these things that are happening, especially in the Valley of the Ashes, which you're going to see is kind of a stomping ground, a catalyst for the sinful actions that all of these characters are going to start to be involved in one way or another. Okay, so we have Tom and Nick right now, and they're in Tom's car. They are traveling somewhere. Nick's not quite sure where he's going, but we find out that they wind up in this garage. And here's the description of the garage. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford, which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hand on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. So Nick's very first response to this area of this rundown garage is that he thinks it's fake. He's never been to a place like this, so it's so cliche to him to be this working class, dusty, dirty garage that he thinks it must be a facade for something else. Obviously, it's not. But if you look at the words that he used to describe the garage up at the top, he used some words like this: unprosperous, bare, dust-covered, wreck, crouched, and dim. And then let's look at the words that he used to describe George Wilson, who we learn is the husband of the man that Tom is having an affair with. So George Wilson is described as blonde, spiritless, anemic, faintly handsome. So we're getting just this overall blah sense that there's nothing remarkable about either the garage or about George Wilson. So Tom and George Wilson talk. We learn that Tom has brought his car to George Wilson several times. So even though Tom is cheating on his wife with Wilson's wife, he is bold enough to come to him and let him fix his car. Now that gives you some picture of how more of Tom's character. And we talked about last week about how despicable Tom is and how Fitzgerald really wants us to hate Tom because it's going to help us to develop some complicated feelings later on. Let's see. Here's some more description of Wilson. Tom says he's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive. And perhaps that's foreshadowing something. Just a little hint there. Then we meet Myrtle. We meet Myrtle Wilson. So this is George Wilson's wife, and this is the woman that Tom is cheating on his wife with, Myrtle Wilson. And here's how Fitzgerald describes Myrtle. Thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light, middle 30s, faintly stout, surplus flesh, no facet or gleam of beauty, and coarse voice. So if you think about Myrtle compared to Daisy, pretty much opposites, right? We get a picture of this woman who is not the stick figure like Daisy is. She is not clouded in this white angelic cloth. She's quite the opposite. She's sharp around the edges. She's, when it comes to her persona, let's look at some of those sounds again that we can hear when we put together the words that Fitzgerald uses to describe her. So let's say those words out loud. Thickish, stout, middle 30s, Myrtle. These are all words that are harsh to say and to hear. Sometimes I don't think that we really pay attention to the sounds that the words say. We just pay attention to what maybe the words mean, their denotation and their connotations. But Fitzgerald, as I have mentioned, really did craft the great American novel. And so he doesn't just use words to describe things because they are perfect descriptors, because they are, but he also makes a sort of melody or music with them. And by choosing these sounds that sound really harsh and are not pretty, when we say them out loud or when we hear them, that tells us a lot about this woman, Myrtle. Even her name, Myrtle, compared to Daisy. Okay. We also learned from Myrtle that she has changed her dress. And this dress that she has changed into when she's about to go off with Tom does not fit. So what can we take away from that? That she is trying to change into this role, this persona that she really is not. We'll see more of that later. She spends Tom's money. She starts to really act like she is this upper class woman, and we know she's not. We saw where she came from. We saw that garage that she was in. So Tom takes Myrtle, and remember, Nick is still with them. So it's this really strange threesome going on right there in the car on their way to Tom Buchanan's extra apartment that he keeps. Then we see this scene here where Myrtle really wants to get a dog. She sees these puppies on the side of the road or on the side of the street that this guy has for sale, and she kind of throws a little hissy fit and gets the dog. It's really interesting when you look at the words that Fitzgerald uses to describe the dog and how that can be really similar to the description of Myrtle. So let's look at some of these descriptors. He describes the dog as an indeterminate breed. He didn't say it was a mutt, but that's basically what that means. So is Myrtle a mutt? Is she trying to be a combination of the upper class and the lower class, and then in that process just indeterminate. Then we have that the dog had a brown coat and Myrtle is wearing that brown muslin dress. We also hear from the man who is selling the dog that the dog won't bother you. Maybe we can say that about Myrtle at this time. Myrtle is just there to have an affair with Tom whenever he wants, but she's not going to bother him in other ways. Tom buys the dog. Does Tom buy Myrtle, in a sense, by giving her this extra little lifestyle on the side? They are both female and not who she claims to be. So the dog claims to be one type of breed, but is not. We know that the man who's selling the dog is lying, and Myrtle is not the high-class breed that she is trying to be. Okay, so let's move on to Tom and Myrtle's apartment. The apartment was on the top floor, a small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom, and a bath. The living room was crowded to the doors with a set of tapestried furniture entirely too large. So it doesn't fit, right? Just like Myrtle does not fit in this dress. The furniture does not fit in the apartment. Things are not quite right. We've got the dog coming in. We've got... let's see, scrolling past that one. Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume sometime before and was now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon, which gave out a continual rustle as she swept about the room. Notice how Fitzgerald uses the word costume when he's talking about the dress that she's changed into. What could that mean? It means that she is, again, trying to be something she's not, trying to be a character that she is not. Her dress is also noisy. Think about that as the harsh character that she is with those words that we talked about earlier. How those were noisy, and her costume is noisy. She's trying to get attention. She's still not that soft, ethereal vision that Daisy is, and that's for a reason. That's for a reason. We're going to see, continually see throughout this book, this contrasting theme between the haves and the have-nots, but how they struggle with the same type of things. All right, let's see if we have any more in here. Yeah. Myrtle tells the story of how she and Tom meet, and in a few minutes I would like for you guys to look at the depiction between the 1970s movie and then the Leonardo DiCaprio movie of this scene. It's really quite interesting to see Myrtle's portrayal of how they met. Okay. And then just a couple last lines of note from this chapter 2. People disappeared, reappeared, made plans to go somewhere, and then lost each other, searched for each other, found each other a few feet away. Let me read that again. People disappeared, reappeared, made plans to go somewhere, and then lost each other, searched for each other, found each other a few feet away. This is foreshadowing something big. So keep this in mind. You might even, I'm going to give you a minute to write this down. Find a piece of paper if you haven't been taking notes already and write this down. This comes up again, or this is going to be a great theme throughout the book. People disappeared, reappeared, made plans to go somewhere, and then lost each other, searched for each other, found each other a few feet away. Pause that if you need to in order to write that down. Okay, as we near the end of this scene, let's read a few more descriptors about Tom. I'm just going to read the words that are highlighted in blue here. Sturdy, hard mouth, arrogant eyes, established dominance, leaning aggressively forward, enormous power, great pack of muscles. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. And if you read, you know what happens to end the party, right? Tom hits Myrtle, let's see, and broke her nose with his open hand. And basically, yeah, let's scroll back up here. And this all came because Mrs. Wilson, which that I didn't mention that before. Why do you think that Fitzgerald is referring to Myrtle as Mrs. Wilson? I think it's to help us remember that she is a married woman. She is not married to Tom. Anyway, so Mrs. Wilson, Myrtle, starts to shout Daisy's name, and that makes Tom lose it, and he hits her, breaks her nose with his open hand, and that's kind of when the party falls apart. Keep in mind, Nick is still here throughout all of this. So other people have come into the apartment as well. Nick is in the midst of just this very confusing middle world, if you want to think of it that way. We're not in the depths of the grunginess of Wilson's garage, but we're also not in the wealth and opulence of the Buchanan's house or in what we're going to see in Gatsby's house either. We're in this middle ground where people are pretending to be other things other than they really are, and having relationships that they're not supposed to, have relationships other than what they really should be having. And I want you to think about that as we go forward in this book about where you really belong, where these characters really belong, and